It was an unbearably hot and humid early summer evening when I finally decided to hitch a ride. I had been walking for hours on a deserted stretch of highway, my water gone and my legs aching. When I heard the rumble of an old pickup truck approaching, I didn't hesitate to stick out my thumb. The truck, rusted and beaten up, slowed down, and the driver, a grizzled man in his 40s with a weathered face and a baseball cap, gave me a quick nod. Without a word, I climbed into the bed of the truck, grateful for the lift. The truck rumbled down the highway, and I let the wind cool me off as we sped through miles of empty road. But soon, the landscape began to change. The driver turned onto a narrow, cracked road that wound through dense woods. The sun was setting, and the once bright sky took on an ominous orange hue. As we entered the town, it became clear this place had seen better days. The buildings were small and dilapidated, many of them boarded up or falling apart. There were old, rusting cars parked haphazardly along the cracked sidewalks, and the air smelled faintly of decay. Despite the time of day, there was no one on the streets. No kids playing, no people heading home from work. The place was eerily quiet. We passed by a small, grimy diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. A couple of men stood outside, leaning against the wall. They were dressed in dirty, worn-out clothes, and their faces were gaunt and unfriendly. As we drove by, they stared at me, their eyes following the truck with a kind of cold curiosity that sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't move, didn't smile, just watched me pass like I was some kind of trespasser in their territory. The truck stopped in front of a dilapidated general store. The driver got out, leaving the engine running, and walked inside without a word. I stayed in the bed, every instinct screaming at me to get out of this town as fast as I could. Then I saw them, men emerging from the shadows, their faces hard and unfriendly. They gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. They kept their distance, but their eyes were locked on me, filled with a mixture of hostility and something else, something darker, more primal. When the driver finally returned, he didn't look at me as he got back into the truck, just started the engine and pulled away from the store. I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As we drove out of town, the people I had seen started to move, slowly at first, then faster, like a wave of shadowy figures closing in behind us. We were almost at the edge of town when something slammed into the side of the truck. The bed lurched violently, and I nearly lost my grip. I turned to see a group of men running after us, their faces twisted with anger, yelling things I couldn't hear over the roar of the engine. One of them threw a rock, and it shattered against the tailgate. The driver slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as we sped out of the town. I looked back and saw the men standing in the road, their figures growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. When we finally reached a main road, the driver stopped and motioned for me to get out. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my backpack, jumped out of the truck, and watched as he drove off without a word. I never learned the name of that town, and I never wanted to. Whatever that place was, it wasn't safe for outsiders. From that day on, I avoided hitchhiking at all costs. Some roads lead to places where you're not meant to go. All I knew was that I was lucky to get out of there alive. I've always been cautious. My mom drilled it into me as a kid. Never talk to strangers, never get into a car with someone you don't know. But life has a way of forcing your hand, and one night, I found myself stranded on a desolate highway with no choice but to hitchhike. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and the road was completely deserted. I'd been driving back from a friend's house when my car broke down. My phone was dead, and there wasn't a gas station or rest stop in sight. The only thing that broke the silence was the occasional car that sped by, headlights illuminating the dark, empty stretch of road before disappearing into the night. After what felt like an eternity, an old, beat-up truck pulled over. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed to refuse, but what choice did I have? So, against my better judgment, I nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. The smell of stale cigarettes and sweat hit me immediately. The man didn't say much at first, just drove in silence as I tried to calm my racing heart. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "Where you headed?" "Just to the nearest town," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He grunted in response, his eyes never leaving the road. I noticed then that the truck's interior was a mess. Old food wrappers, empty beer cans, and something else that caught my eye. A long length of rope coiled on the floor near his feet. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just a messy guy. But the way his fingers drummed against the steering wheel, the way his eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, it all set me on edge. "Mind if I take a detour?" he asked suddenly. "What? Why?" I stammered. "Just gotta check on something real quick," he said, his tone making it clear that it wasn't a question. I didn't argue. I didn't know this man, didn't know what he was capable of. The road ahead darkened as he turned off the highway onto a narrow, winding path. Trees loomed on either side, their branches creating twisted shadows under the moonlight. My pulse quickened. I was trapped. The truck was speeding up, the trees blurring past as we ventured deeper into the woods. Panic began to claw at my throat. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and casually locked the doors, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. That's when I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. He slowed the truck, pulling up to the cabin's front. My mind raced. There was no one around for miles. If I didn't do something, I might never get out of here. Just as he was about to turn off the engine, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and jumped out of the moving truck. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of the truck door slamming behind me fueling my terror. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I saw headlights in the distance. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The driver, a young woman, rushed out to help me. I begged her to drive, to get me out of there, and she did. As we sped away, I glanced back at the cabin and held my gaze at the man standing there, watching us, until I didn't see him anymore. Needless to say, I never hitchhiked again. It was around midnight when we realized we were hopelessly lost. My friend Tom and I had been driving for hours, trying to make it through the night on a road trip that had already taken a turn for the worse. We were exhausted, hungry, and desperate to find a rest stop. The highway was long and empty, stretching endlessly through the pitch-black night. Our headlights were the only source of light, cutting through the darkness like a knife. We hadn't seen another car for miles when we spotted a figure up ahead, standing on the side of the road. A hitchhiker. Normally, I wouldn't even consider picking someone up this late at night, but something about the situation felt different. Maybe it was the fatigue clouding my judgment, or maybe it was the sheer desperation for some company other than Tom and me. Either way, I slowed the car as we approached, and Tom gave me a questioning look, but he didn't object. The hitchhiker looked to be about our age. He was dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something strange about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His face was almost childlike, angelic, yet his icy blue eyes seemed to have a mystical, distant quality, like he was deep in thought or had experienced things far beyond his years. He climbed into the back seat, extremely grateful for the ride. Tom and I tried to make small talk, asking the usual questions, where he was headed, where he was from. He answered politely and even engaged in small talk. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror a few times. He didn't look like a serial killer, but there was still something unsettling about him. Tom must have felt it too, because he grew quieter as the minutes passed, the easy banter between us fading into an uncomfortable silence. I was focusing on the highway ahead when, out of nowhere, the hitchhiker spoke, his voice calm but carried a weight that made every hair on my body stand on end. He said, "I have been sent to deliver a message. The end is near." Tom and I froze. I didn't want to believe what I had just heard. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at Tom, who looked as stunned as I felt. I forced myself to look into the rearview mirror, expecting to see the hitchhiker sitting there with that same distant look on his face. But the back seat was empty. My blood ran cold as I scanned the back seat, hoping, praying that my eyes were playing tricks on me, that somehow I had missed him shifting in his seat. But there was no one there. He was just gone. Panic gripped me. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the deserted highway. Tom whipped around in his seat, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. We both stared at the empty back seat. "What the hell just happened?" Tom screamed. One moment, the hitchhiker was there, and the next, he had vanished without a trace. I couldn't think straight. My mind was spinning. How could someone just disappear like that? Where did he go? And most importantly, what did he mean by, "the end is near"? We poked our heads out the window, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing by the side of the road again, watching us. But there was no one. Nothing but the dark, empty highway. We didn't speak as I slowly put the car back in gear and started driving again. Tom kept glancing back at the rear seat, as if hoping that the hitchhiker would reappear and somehow explain what had just happened. But the back seat remained empty. The words the hitchhiker had spoken echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain that I couldn't shake. What did he know? What was coming? We eventually found a rest stop, but neither of us could sleep. We sat in the car, wide-eyed and alert, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the rest of the night passed in eerie silence. By morning, the fear had dulled and we continued our journey, but the mood was somber. We didn't talk about it much, but I knew Tom was just as shaken as I was. The hitchhiker's message was something we couldn't forget, no matter how much we tried to push it from our minds. To this day, I don't know who or what that hitchhiker was or where he came from, but I can't shake the feeling that he was more than just a lost traveler. Sometimes late at night, I find myself wondering if that night was just a prelude to something much worse, a warning that we should heed before it's too late.